Well, my name's Steve Clearman, and we're sitting in my what I call the lower barn, which is where I have my office and most of my motorcycle collection, which is in Columbia County, upstate New York, a little bit south of Albany and east of the Hudson River. Yeah, well, my attraction to machinery goes way back to, very early boyhood days. And actually, it's a visual pleasure. At least that's what I remember. I remember as a very little boy, my father, who was a professor of physics, brought me to where he worked, and there was laboratories, but there's also a little machine shop. And I remember standing at the lathe and just being fascinated by visually what the thing looked like. You have pieces of cast iron that have been machined very smooth, and they're very warm, kind of reflective glow that gives off. And so that's a very early memory, and he put me up on a stool and showed me how to turn a little brass bar, and that was pretty much a magical experience. Later on, when as a sort of pre-teenager, walking down the street in Port Washington, where there was a infamous or famous motorcycle shop called Ghost Motorcycle, and looking up at the window, seeing a Vincent. And the Vincent, particularly from the right side of the bike, is a very impressive piece of machinery. It's quite unusual looking, and very muscular, kind of painted surfaces and polished aluminum surfaces and rough aluminum surfaces and stainless steel bits, and it has all these different sort of materials in the whole combination. The actual forms, and then these different kinds of surfaces, different reflectivity, and it was just the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. At that time, that's when I sort of thought, well, motorcycles are great. I got to get a motorcycle someday, which, I did later on. But it was that visual thing that actually got me sucked into believing that I love motorcycles. And so later on, my first job, I was working in a machine shop, off and on, as something which I enjoyed doing and could make a little money at. I did that. I was going to law school in my late 20s or mid-20s, and unlike anybody else going to law school with me, I'd go off in the afternoons when I didn't have any classes, and I'd go work in a machine shop. And, it was fun. And so there's something that always sucked me in. I first saw that bike. I was on a ride in Death Valley. It's an old Indian. It's a 1938 Indian chief. And there was a fellow from Southern California who was acquainted with somebody else I know down there who owned this bike, a guy named Stewie. And he was a real old-time biker. He had a very marginal life economically, and he looked the part. He was large, disheveled, but a very nice guy, very nice guy. And he had this bike, and what I loved about the bike is that it was highly functional, old thing. So it was a 1938 bike. He had owned it for a bunch of years. It had that barn find look, because it was different shades of rust, a little bit of paint here and there. One of my favorite features of it is that on the front fender, there was a bronze boat cleat, the kind of thing you'd have on a small boat, to tie a line to. And I was thinking, how'd that end up on the front of this bike, some kind of a nautical thing, and what possible use did anybody? And the bike worked, so it was like, wow, this is a beautiful thing. That the idea that it's been maintained mechanically, so it's fully functional, and yet it's just been kind of 40-something years of patina. Stewart, I guess, ran into tough times and needed to sell the bike because it was probably the only thing he had between whatever, starvation. And so the bike got sold through a friend of mine to somebody else. But I kept at it, so I knew where it was. And a number of years later, I had the opportunity to buy it. But I like the fact that this was his bike, Stewart's bike. This was, he was a biker, a true biker. That was his life. It wasn't a life with tremendous variety of activities. It was a limited life of someone who was pretty marginal. And it was his identity to a large extent. And it was something which appealed to me aesthetically as being a perfect example of what it was, like an old, beat up, highly functioning, but totally beat up, and yet beautiful old relic. But also I like it because it represents sort of an image of a particular guy's life. To me, he's representative of the the whole biker subculture, which kind of doesn't really exist anymore, but in America, they had this biker subculture, which was kind of a little bit of an outlaw thing, and and back there was a time when there were a lot of guys out there that their lives revolved around their bikes, and they were marginal, and a lot of them were very nice guys, like this guy was, and some of them were, seriously bad hoodlums and all the rest of that. But the bike, to me, I look at it and I see what's there, and I also see, my vision of Stewart and what he represented in terms of the subculture. No, this sort of the fascination with machinery is just, it's something that is part of me. But I've never been able to throw it off, and there have been times in my life when I say, what are you doing with all this stuff? It's stupid. It's like, it takes up room, and I'm kind of accepted the idea it doesn't matter what it's about. I get pleasure out of it.